We had finally made it. After years of struggling, bouncing from one low-paying job to another, Mary and I had secured good jobs in New York City and managed to find an affordable apartment. It wasn't in the best neighborhood, but it was our own little corner of the world. We were ecstatic to start this new chapter in our lives. The apartment was small but cozy. It had a certain charm with its creaky wooden floors and the way the light filtered through the old, oversized windows. Our first few days were a blur of unpacking and exploring the city. Everything seemed perfect, at least at first. Our neighbor, on the other hand, was a different story. From the moment we moved in, there was something off about him. He lived directly across the hall, and we could hear him coming and going at all hours of the night. He was tall, gaunt, with eyes that seemed to pierce right through you. His name was Mr. Blackwood, a fitting name for someone who seemed to be enveloped in a constant aura of darkness. The first night we noticed something strange was a Friday. We heard Mr. Blackwood returning home very late, his heavy footsteps echoing through the hallway. I was getting ready for bed when I glanced through the peephole and saw him dragging a young woman into his apartment. She seemed intoxicated, barely able to stand on her own. "Did you see that?" I asked Mary, my voice barely above a whisper. "See what?" she replied, her face half buried in a pillow. "Mr. Blackwood, he just brought a girl into his apartment." Mary groaned. "It's probably just his girlfriend. Don't overthink it." But I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling gnawing at my gut. The next day, I kept an eye out for any sign of the girl. She never left the apartment. Over the following week, I noticed a pattern. Every few nights, Mr. Blackwood would bring home a different girl, always in the early hours of the morning, and every time the girl would vanish, as if swallowed by the darkness of his apartment. I voiced my concerns to Mary, but she dismissed them as paranoia. "It's a big city," she said. "People come and go. You can't just assume the worst." But I couldn't let it go. One night, I decided to follow him. I waited until he left, then slipped out and trailed him at a distance. He wandered the streets, finally stopping at a dimly lit bar. Hours passed, and then I saw him again, this time with a new girl on his arm. She was laughing, completely oblivious to the danger she was in. I rushed back home, heart pounding, and waited. Sure enough, Mr. Blackwood returned with the girl. I watched through the peephole as they disappeared into his apartment. Minutes turned into hours, and my anxiety grew with each passing second. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I decided to confront him. I grabbed a kitchen knife for protection and crept across the hall. My hand shook as I knocked on his door. There was no answer, but I could hear movement inside. Gathering my courage, I tried the door. It was unlocked. I pushed it open, the hinges creaking ominously. "Hello?" My voice echoed through the dimly lit apartment. The air was thick with a metallic smell that made my stomach churn. As I moved further inside, the apartment seemed to grow colder. I stepped into the living room and froze. The walls were covered in blood. Dark, congealed stains smeared across the wallpaper, spelling out words I couldn't understand. And there, in the center of the room, was the girl. Her lifeless eyes stared blankly at the ceiling, her body contorted in a way that no living being could survive. I stumbled back, my scream lodged in my throat. I turned to flee, but Mr. Blackwood was standing in the doorway, a twisted smile on his face. "Leaving so soon?" His voice was a sinister whisper. I raised the knife, but he was faster. He lunged at me, and I felt a searing pain as the knife slipped from my grasp. The world spun, and I collapsed to the floor, darkness creeping into the edges of my vision. The last thing I saw was Mary, standing in the doorway of our apartment, her face a mask of horror as she realized the true nature of our neighbor. Days later, the police would find our bodies, and the grisly truth would come to light. Mr. Blackwood was a killer, a predator who used the city as his hunting ground. But by then, it would be too late for us. He had already claimed his victims, leaving behind nothing but fear and despair.